27 years ago, a whole class of students went missing while on a field trip. Their families were devastated, and authorities suspected the male teacher was involved. However, there were no bodies found and few leads, so the investigation eventually went cold. Despite this, one desperation mother never gave up hope, clinging to the slim possibility that her daughter was still alive. One day, while perusing old photographs, she spotted a. Laura Calloway woke up on the morning of September 28, 2023, with a heavy heart. The gray cloudy sky outside her window mirrored her somber mood. She had been preparing herself for this day, but even so, the grief and heartache were overwhelming. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from today. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe. As Laura rose from her bed and made her way to the dressing table, she saw a close-up photo of her daughter Rory in her school uniform hanging on the mirror. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at her daughter's smiling face. "Oh, Rory," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. To protect herself from the tsunami of sorrow that was about to consume her, Laura took a deep breath. Having faced unimaginable hardships over the past 27 years, Laura knew she had to remain resilient. After getting dressed and washing her face, she checked her phone and saw a message from her best friend Helen Carter. Helen was a mother of one of the missing children, and Laura found some solace in this. So she responded to Helen's message, asking if it would be all right to come over. Helen's response was warm and inviting. So Laura retrieved some Earl Grey lavender tea and cookies from her cupboard before heading to her friend's house. The idea of showing up empty-handed still made Laura sad, even after all these years of friendship. As she walked the short distance to Helen's, she couldn't help but think about how lonely she had felt since her husband had died. Helen had become one of the few people who could truly understand her. Helen's house was just a few blocks away, so she could see the front door open before she even had a chance to knock. Helen welcomed her with a warm smile and a comforting embrace, saying, "Come in softly," as she led Laura down the familiar streets. The houses looked much the same as they had 27 years ago, a stark contrast to how much her life had changed. On this particularly trying day, Helen turned to Laura and asked, "How are you doing?" Laura sighed, her eyes cast downward, and said, "I'm trying to keep up." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and handed Helen the cookie jar and tea packets. The two of them headed to the kitchen, where Helen set about boiling water for the tea. Laura, meanwhile, settled onto the living room sofa. Helen nodded, understanding that I still deal with the past. I finished therapy last year, and although I've accepted it and try not to let it consume me, I still can't deny that today is particularly difficult. I'm not sure if that means I need to return to therapy, but I'm not sure either way. The kettle whistled, and Helen poured hot water into 2 cups, setting them on the coffee table in front of the sofa. As they sat down to drink tea, the soothing scent of Earl Grey and lavender wafted through the room, reminding them that they were not alone in their sorrow. Helen set her teacup down, and Laura felt grateful for the bond she had formed with Helen as a result of their shared tragedy. They had supported each other through the years when it appeared like no one else could comprehend their anguish. She smiled softly and turned to Laura. "You know, my psychologist told me something that's been helpful. She said that we should face our pain whenever it comes and accept it as part of ourselves, not try to hide or bypass it." Helen paused, carefully considering her next words. "I was thinking, maybe we could look at some photos together. If you're up for it." Laura took another sip of her tea, letting the warm liquid soothe her. After a moment, she nodded. "I think that might be good with that." Helen stood up and made her way to the... Helen retrieved a photo album from the TV cabinet, sat down next to Laura on the sofa, and placed the album in the middle of them. As they turned the pages, a wave of memories rushed over them. The photos captured happier times, such as their children's first days of school, birthday parties, and family picnics. Hillary and Laura found themselves laughing and crying as they reminisced about the past and shared stories. Helen, with a nostalgic smile on her face, nodded at a photo of the 2 girls in their uniforms. "Grade 5, right?" Laura confirmed. The school had only been open for 2 years at that point. Helen reflected on the school's marketing efforts, which had resulted in a dramatic increase from 6 students to 15 by the end of that year. As they continued to flip through the album, Laura's attention was abruptly captivated by A. Helen examined the photograph and explained, "I received it from the police a few months ago since the case went cold. They allowed parents to collect it." This was a photo that Laura had never seen before. It showed Rory and Sally and other classmates working on a science project for the school science fair. The children's faces lit up with enthusiasm as they worked on the project, and they had no idea that tragedy would soon befall them. I went to the station and asked for all the evidence they had. Laura was surprised. "I didn't realize we could do that." Helen smiled sadly at her, suggesting that maybe it's for the best that you didn't. "Having all this evidence has made it harder for me to move on, which is why I needed therapy. I spent countless sleepless nights going over the files, hoping to find anything that would help us find answers." As Laura combed through the photos, she came across another unfamiliar image. It was a class picture taken in front of a yellow school bus, the same bus that had transported the children on that tragic trip. Laura studied the photo carefully, looking at every face. Then she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. With a voice filled with confusion and a hint of hope, she asked, "Why is Principal Lillian Brooks in this picture?" She had thought that classroom teacher Mr. Gregory had gone alone with the students and that one support person. Helen leaned in for a closer look, her expression betraying her uncertainty. "I'm not entirely sure," she said, her brow furrowing. "I remember hearing rumors from some other parents that the staff member was actually the principal, but I never gave it much thought. Something was off, though," and Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. For all these years, she had believed that the trip had consisted of just the teacher and a co-tier or administrative staff. However, the presence of the principal in this photo raised questions she had never considered before, so she began to unravel the mystery. Helen placed a gentle hand on Laura's arm as she spoke softly. "I know that look in your eyes. We've been down this road before, thinking we found something crucial dozens, if not hundreds of times. It's not good for us to cling to false hope." Laura wanted to argue that this detail could be important, but she saw concern in Helen's eyes and took a deep breath to calm herself, even though she still clung to the nagging notion. Helen smiled sympathetically and returned her attention to the photo album, where she pointed to the bus in the background. She said that the photo was probably taken before the school trip, which would explain the principal's presence. Laura nodded, but she wasn't completely convinced. She glanced at the wall clock and realized that they had been talking for nearly an hour. Before leaving, Helen stood up and said, "I want to visit Rory's grave. Bring her some." Helen nodded in understanding. "Sure. Would you like some company?" Laura asked, her eyes betraying her reluctance. "It's nice of you, but I know you prefer to go with Matthew later." "I'll be fine," Helen said, pausing as she turned back to Laura. "Would it be all right if I took that photo with me, the one with the school bus?" Laura asked, pausing again as she prepared to leave. As she departed from Helen's house and headed to the bus stop, a sense of significance washed over her. The image of Principal Lillian Brooks standing with the children before their tragic journey remained a jigsaw piece in her mind, contradicting the narrative she had been apprised of for the previous 27 years. Laura promised her friend that she would exercise caution and not allow herself to be consumed by the situation. Was going to take her to town to pick up flowers from her favorite florist, but Laura was torn between two conflicting emotions, a longing to find out what happened and a fear of revisiting old wounds. As the sky grew darker, she prayed silently that the rain would stop so she could visit the cemetery and pay her respects to her daughter's memory in peace. Highways she knew well led to the town center, where she clutched the photo of her daughter and her classmates, unable to look away. Helen had warned her not to cling to false hope, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Why had some parents believed the principal had gone on the trip, while others, like herself, had been told it was just the... She took great pride in being an active and involved parent, attending all gatherings, meetings, and even the school trials and hearings. So how had this crucial detail slipped her notice? Laura hesitated for a moment before pulling out her phone. She had the officer's personal number saved from a long time, but she wasn't sure if he would remember her or even want to. The thought made her stomach clench, but she was determined to find out. Determined to make the call regardless. She looked around the nearly deserted bus. The worn seats bore faint graffiti, and the dim fluorescent lights flickered intermittently. Outside, the neighborhood faded into the background as she took a deep breath and dialed the number. The first call went unanswered, so she swallowed and tried again. This time, too, nothing. Just the mechanical drone of a voicemail prompt. Laura's fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to leave a message or not. How should she proceed? She shook her head and ended the call without leaving a voicemail, feeling foolish and desperate. She slipped her phone back into her purse. As the bus jerked slightly at another stop, she glanced outside and suddenly felt a jolt of recognition. The sight of the old neighborhood sent a chill down her spine, stirring memories she thought she had buried. Without fully considering it, she stood up just as I pressed the bell and stepped out of the bus, apologizing to the driver. Standing on the sidewalk, I felt stupid. I didn't know if the principal was home or if she still lived at the same address after all these years. I vaguely remembered the street, but I couldn't remember the exact house number. Looking at the bus schedule at the stop, I saw that the next bus wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes. I figured I might as well try while I'm. Laura started strolling down the street, looking at the houses in search of anything familiar. The neighborhood had changed over the years, with some houses renovated and others showing their age. After a few minutes of aimless wandering, she came across a house that brought back a vague memory. Standing on the sidewalk, she studied the property, which had a well-kept garden with cut hedges and vibrant flower beds. In the driveway, there was a car, but Laura couldn't tell whose it belonged to. As Laura paused on the sidewalk, she reflected on the few occasions they had had meaningful conversations. On the day of the disappearance, the principal had expressed her condolences. On another occasion, when Laura and other parents had gathered at her house to protest, they had exchanged words, and despite sharing a neighborhood, their interactions had been limited. Taking a deep breath, Laura continued. As Laura was about to leave, embarrassed by her impulsive decision, she noticed two women walking along the sidewalk. One seemed to be in her mid-30s, while the other was older, closer to Laura's age. As they turned onto the walkway leading to the house, their eyes met, and Laura immediately recognized the older woman as Principal Lillian Brooks, even though time had added lines. Principal Brooks froze for a moment, her composure slipping as she began to stutter. "Oh, Mrs. Calloway, please, just give me a moment," Laura said nervously, turning to the younger woman guiding her towards the house. It seemed like the principal didn't recognize her at first, but her expression was polite and questioning. "Can I help you?" she asked in a kind but cautious voice. "You go inside and make yourself at home. I'll be right there while the principal fumbles with the door keys." Laura's thoughts raced because she knew the principal didn't have any children. So why was she interrupting this younger woman? Once the younger woman entered, Principal Brooks followed. Laura noticed that the lights were turned on, so she decided to get closer to the doorway and wait at the threshold. She debated whether to call out or wait, but when the principal finally opened the door, she answered the door. Lillian hurriedly wiped her hands dry on the sides of her blouse, as if she had just finished washing them. "I'm so sorry for the wait," she said, forcing a small laugh. "I hesitated. Forgive me, but your name it." The house was eerily quiet except for the faintest murmur of voices in the distance. After a beat, she raised her hand and knocked again, this time with a little more force. Suddenly, the door swung open wider. As Laura took a deep breath, she finally spoke up. "I'm Rory Calloway's mother," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "My daughter went missing during the school trip in 1996. The principal's expression turned pale as she struggled to keep her smile on. Laura couldn't help but notice how nervous she seemed, her eyes darting between the woman and the barely open door behind her. From inside the house, Laura could see the woman. Didn't participate in the discussion, but she remained silently by the side, as if observing. Principal Brooks swallowed and tried to collect herself. "I'm no longer the school principal," Mrs. Calloway said, her voice unwavering. "You see, I took early retirement some years ago. May I ask why you're here?" Laura hesitated for a moment before answering directly. I have a question about the day of the school trip. Principal Lillian glanced over her shoulder at the woman inside before returning to Laura. All right, Laura said grudgingly, but I can't stay long because I have a guest waiting. Principal Brooks nodded in understanding and took out the class photo from her purse. Laura held it up for Principal Lillian to see. Principal Brooks seemed lost in thought as she studied the photo, her brow furrowing. Curious, Laura pressed on, asking, "Were you on the trip that day?" The principal's eyes widened, and she shook her head in disbelief. "No, I stayed at the school. Mr. Gregory, the classroom teacher, and a staff member from administration went on the trip. It was supposed to be me, but I had to attend to an important last-minute matter, so the admin took my place." Laura nodded slowly, taking in the information. It confirmed her previous beliefs, but something still didn't add up. In an effort to avoid going overboard, she decided to ask one last question. "Principal Brooke, did you notice anything suspicious about Mr. Gregory that day?" Her voice took on an edge of annoyance as she replied, "No, Mrs. Calloway. I've given all these statements to the police countless times. I never would have done it. I would never have imagined that Mr. Gregory could be capable of something like this." She paused, her expression softening slightly, and said, "I would prefer not to speak about it anymore. It was heartbreaking for me, too. I found closure. I don't want to open old wounds again." Laura felt a pang of guilt at the principal's words. She hadn't meant to cause more pain. "I understand the pain, Mrs. Calloway. It's one of the reasons I took early retirement. As long as I worked at that school, I could never overcome the grief." Laura reached into her purse and pulled out a pocket tissue, dabbing at her eyes. As her vision cleared, she noticed the younger woman inside, watching them intently, with a mix of curiosity and concern in her gaze. Principal Brooks's expression softened further, went forward and briefly embraced Laura, saying, "I know that today marks 27 years. You're not the first parent to come here on this day. Over the years," Laura was taken aback by the principal's unexpected display of emotion, so she returned the photo to her purse. As they parted ways, she forced a weak smile and thanked the principal for her time. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, what with the principal's initial hesitation and the presence of the. As she made her way back to the bus stop, her mind was racing with conflicting thoughts and emotions. The rain, which had threatened all day, finally began to fall, joining her somber mood. At the shelter of the stop, she pulled out her phone and pondered over it, considering whether to reach out to the assigned police officer again. However, before Laura could make a decision, the bus came. She boarded and took a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away from the curb, she held the photo close to her chest. The rain outside continued to fall in a steady rhythm, but at least the wind had died down. Laura sat on the bus, her mind still racing with questions and thoughts from her encounter with Principal Brooks. Laura stepped out into the light drizzle as she disembarked from the bus. Just down the street stood a florist shop, its colorful display of flowers standing in stark contrast to the gray day. As she approached, she paused under the brightly lit sign. However, her hopes were dashed, as the screen remained blank and no response from the police officer. It was as if something wasn't quite right. Sitting under the awning of a nearby shop, she waited for the rain to stop. She questioned whether calling again would make a difference after her conversation with the principal. She doubted she would hear anything new. Instead, she assumed the officer would simply repeat what she had already heard. With a sigh, she put the phone back in her bag. Perhaps Ellen was right. Perhaps she was just reopening old wounds for no reason. Regardless of her efforts to ignore it, the image of the young woman struggling with. Laura, fed up with Principal Brooks' tense behavior, gathered her courage and dashed for the florist shop, her purse serving as a makeshift umbrella. The rain clung to her skin, seeping through her clothes, but she hardly noticed since she only needed to cross the street. Once she reached the shop, she pushed open the door and the gentle chime of the bell overhead announced her arrival. As soon as she stepped inside, the cold rain turned to a warm, comforting aroma of flowers. Mrs. Calloway, the florist, recognized her and asked if they would be seeing each other today. Laura mustered a small smile and said, "Hello, Sarah. I'm here for my usual order." Sarah started gathering the flowers that Laura usually chooses for Rory's grave, but she noticed that the selection was smaller than in years past. Feeling a pang of disappointment, Sarah apologized and explained that this year's unpredictable weather had affected their suppliers, so there wasn't as much variety. Laura nodded in understanding and continued to gather flowers for Rory. Just then, the bell above the door chimed again, and Laura turned to see Helen and her husband Matthew enter the shop. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment Laura saw. Helen's expression changed from surprise to concerned as she approached her friend Laura and asked, "I thought you'd have gone to the florist earlier. Is everything all right?" Laura hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal about her unexpected visit to Principal Brooks's house. Finally, she said, "It's good to see you both again." Matthew shook Laura's hand and asked, "It's good to see you too, Laura. How are you holding up?" Before Laura could respond, Sarah came back with an armful of flowers and approached them, saying, "Here you are, Mrs. Quay. Would you like to?" Laura nodded, appreciative of the diversion. "Sure, Sarah. I'll take care of that." With a delicate touch, she started to arrange the flowers one stem at a time. Helen and Matthew each picked out a bouquet for Sally's grave, and the shop was peaceful save for the faint sound of paper shuffling and the couple's whispers. Laura was absorbed in her thoughts as she worked, her hands seemingly moving on their own will, creating a stunning arrangement. As she finished tying a ribbon around the bouquet, Laura glanced up to see Helen watching her with a mixture of affection and concern. "That's beautiful," Helen whispered, gently mentioning that Rory would have loved it. Tears welled up in Laura's eyes at the mention of her daughter's name, but she managed to say, "I hope." Her mind wandered back to her encounter with Principal Brooks, and she wondered whether she should tell Helen about it. Would her friend understand her suspicions, or if she would think Laura was grasping at straws? As the three of them walked to the counter to pay for their flowers, Sarah carefully wrapped Helen's bouquet. Laura couldn't help but study her friend's face, which revealed a mix of emotions, sadness, grief, and a sense of acceptance that Laura admired. Out of the blue, Laura spoke to Helen in a low voice, saying, "There's something I need to tell you about today." Helen looked at Laura with a mix of curiosity and concern, and Laura took a deep breath. Laura felt the weight of Helen's probing gaze as she turned to leave the shop. She owed her friend an explanation, but she didn't know how to express her suspicions without coming across as overly dramatic. "So, after leaving your house, I went to see Principal Brooks," and her eyes widened in surprise. "What the fuck?" Before Laura could explain, Sarah handed them their wrapped bouquets, saying, "Here you are, ladies. I hope these bring you some comfort today." Laura nodded in agreement as they walked towards Matthew's car, knowing that she would have to share what she had learned with Helen. However, as she clutched her bouquet of flowers, a small part of her wondered if she was ready to face the potential consequences of digging up the past once. Chasing Ghost was playing in the background as they stepped out onto the sidewalk, the rain having finally stopped, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent in the air. Once again, as they settled into Matthew's car, the air was heavy with questions. Helen looked over at Laura, her expression a mix of worry and curiosity. "Why did you go see Principal Brooks? What were you hoping to find?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Laura drew a deep breath, clutching the bouquet of flowers in her lap. She knew she had to be careful with her words because she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the class photo with the school bus. Helen's brow furrowed the one. "I asked her about the photo we looked at earlier, and she said it was taken at the school before the trip. However, when I asked Helen about it, she quickly changed her story and said it was taken before the trip. Doesn't that seem strange? I got the impression that she was trying to hide something." Laura gave an animated explanation, her voice quivering with suspicion. Matthew glanced at Laura in the rearview mirror, his expression remaining neutral. "Laura, it's been 27 years, Matthew said, his expression remaining unchanged. "Remember, memory can play tricks on us, especially with such a traumatizing experience." Laura nodded in agreement. "But there was something else. When I got to her house, there was a young woman I'd never met before, along with the principal. The principal appeared anxious, as if she didn't want the other woman to overhear our conversation. After a brief silence, Helen spoke in a soft but firm voice, telling Laura, "I get it. You need answers, believe me. But we've been here before, 3 years ago." As they drove silently towards the cemetery, Laura stared out the window, watching as the town gave way to more rural surroundings. She couldn't help but feel embarrassed by the memory of the time she thought she'd found a connection between the bus driver and that cold case in Oregon. She had spent weeks convinced she'd uncovered a vital clue, only for it to lead nowhere. This time, she insisted, though a small part of her wondered if she was trying to convince herself as much as her friends. As they drew near the cemetery gates, the sky began to clear and patches of blue began to peek through the clouds. Matthew spoke up, telling Laura, "We care about you. We don't want you to get hurt again by false hope." Laura nodded, her voice trailing off. "I know," she whispered, "but I can't help the feelings." Helen reached back and squeezed Laura's hand. "I do," she agreed, "but sometimes the truth is that we may never." As he pulled into the parking spot, Matthew, a wave of mixed emotions washed over Laura. There was the familiar sadness, the persistent hope, and now a new sense of resolve. Her friends meant well, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her meeting with Principal Brooks had opened a door that had long been closed. Stepping out into the cool, damp air, the scent of freshly turned dirt lingered as they made their way through the cemetery, the rain having finally stopped. Laura approached Rory's tombstone with a heavy heart, knelt down, and placed the bouquet of flowers gently at its base. The petals, still fresh from morning dew, added a small burst of color against the GRY stone. Helen and Laura had arranged the flowers together as a small comfort in their shared grief, and their footsteps were muffled by the soft ground as they walked close enough to Rory and Sally's graves, though not side by side. Tracing her fingers over the grave name, as if memorizing it all over again, the weight of the empty tomb beneath it pierced her heart. The absence of Rory's remains had left them without closure, and this stone monument served as both a solace and a haunting reminder of everything they didn't know. With a quiet sigh, she retrieved a worn photograph from her purse and held it up, studying her. Laura's heart sank as memories of Rory's laughter and how she would playfully pull at her sleeve to get attention flooded her mind. As she kissed Rory goodbye, tears welled up in her eyes and spilled out. She let herself grieve the pain and remember the day it all happened, not trying to hold back her sobs this time, but letting them flow freely. Finally, when the burden of her sorrow lifted just enough for her to breathe, she wiped away her tears. Laura, her eyes watering, rose to her feet and looked over at Helen and Matthew, who stood a short distance away at Sally's grave, their expressions betraying their quiet grief. Laura prepared to join them, but as she was about to approach Helen, something caught her attention. In the distance, near the plot where the majority of the schoolchildren were laid to rest, Laura spotted a familiar figure, the young woman from Principal Brooks's house. She wasn't merely passing by. She was standing there. Laura, her heart racing, instinctively turned away from the woman as she stood in the section of the cemetery where the majority of the missing school children had been laid to rest. Many families had chosen this particular burial site because it was the only proper cemetery in the neighborhood, and she continued to stare down at a headstone with her hands clasped together as if in quiet contemplation. Was this a mere coincidence, or was there something more to it? In the opposite direction, a woman gently patted Helen's arm and whispered, "I'll be right back." Before Helen or Matthew could speak, Laura hurriedly approached the young woman, who was clearly upset and visibly shaking as she stood before one of the graves. "Excuse me," Laura whispered softly so as not to startle the woman. A mix of surprise and fear flashed across the woman's face as she recognized Laura. She frantically wiped away her tears, seemingly trying to hide them. As we reunite, Laura's gaze remained fixed on the woman. "I believe I saw you at Principal Lillian's house earlier," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I come here every year on this day to grieve," she added, her expression one of discomfort. "I apologize," Laura added swiftly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I usually visit early in the morning," she added, "but I don't mean to intrude." Dawn, but I was running behind schedule today, she said, looking at her watch. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The woman paused, her lips slightly parted before pressing them together again. She appeared to consider her response before giving a slow, almost reluctant nod. Laura sensed her unease and didn't press further. However, as her eyes drifted toward the tombstone, she noticed the silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. The woman approached the graveyard, where she saw a small, framed photograph. The image was slightly blurry due to the photo's age, but Laura could still make out the outline of a young girl's face. As soon as Laura looked up, the woman reached down and grabbed the photograph, holding it tightly to her chest. "I apologize," Laura whispered. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy." Laura met the woman's eyes, which were filled with understanding. "You must have really loved and missed your sister. I understand that feeling." For fear of further upsetting the woman, Laura hesitated before turning to ask, "Why did you visit Principal Lillian's house earlier?" Laura's expression betrayed her surprise as she faced the woman head-on, studying her expression. Something more than curiosity, something deeper, something cautious. "I was simply inquiring about the day of the school trip," Laura confessed. "My intention was to." Laura reached into her purse and withdrew a slightly wrinkled photograph that Helen had shown her. She held it out to my friend Helen, who was still standing by S's grave. I had never seen this photo before, and it confused me. I don't remember Principal Lillian being there that day. As the woman stared at the picture, her grip on her own framed it more tightly. Principal Lillian confirmed that the photograph was taken in the school parking lot before the trip, but Laura shook her head slightly inside. Unsure of how to continue, the woman stared at the photograph, her expression changing as she absorbed the children's faces. A light-hearted laugh, tinged with sadness, escaped her lips, but as she lingered on one face in particular, tears streamed down her cheeks, and words, whispered with an air of affection, came out of her mouth. The woman's voice sounded startled, as if she hadn't anticipated anyone listening. She handed Laura the class picture back, her hands quivering slightly. "I'm Rory's mother," Laura said, her voice unwavering despite the whirlwind of emotions within her. "Do you know anything about Rory?" the woman asked, her tone holding a bittersweet warmth that tugged at Laura's heart. Her posture took a sudden defensive turn, as if Laura had cornered her. Laura felt confused and a wave of fear wash over her as she noticed the woman's eyes dart toward the framed photograph, which she still clutched to her chest. The striking resemblance between the two girls in the photo sent shivers down Laura's spine. "Who are you?" Laura asked, her tone measured and her pulse racing. The woman's response was a hasty and vehement "No," she yelled, but the fear in her voice gave the impression that she was referring to the girl in the photo. Stepping closer, Laura gently said, "You don't need to be scared. Are you one of the survivors?" The woman shook her head rapidly, her eyes flashing with panic. Laura could see the conflict in her gaze, but the woman insisted, "I think you're mistaken." "It's not me," Laura responded with a firm yet compassionate voice. "You know, it's 100% you." The woman's shoulders shook as she looked. Laura implored, her voice barely audible above a whisper, "Please, it's better for everyone if you don't know who I am. The pain of my daughter's disappearance has been eating me alive for all these years. I come here every year to honor her, and every time I come, the pain in my heart eases a little. But this day is like a devil's cycle. It's an endless torment on my soul." Tears welled up in her eyes as she pleaded with the audience. Coming closer, Laura's voice became steadier as she asked the woman, "Why were you at Principal Lillian's house earlier?" "You can't be her daughter." "I know Lillian doesn't have a daughter." The question hung heavy with unspoken implications, causing the woman to catch her breath and feel as though the world had stopped spinning as they were both entangled in a web of secrets and unimaginable truths. After a long pause, the woman continued, "Please tell me anything you know." Audrey finally broke her silence, her voice barely audible, and said, "You're right. I am one of the missing students, a survivor." Laura's heart raced with shock as she struggled to comprehend the gravity of the news. When a woman confirmed that Audrey's name was Audrey Whitman, A wave of recognition washed over her. Audrey's name had been etched onto the tombstone she had seen on numerous occasions, serving as a haunting reminder of the tragedy. Laura whispered, attempting to keep her from crying. "Did your family know you were alive?" Laura inquired gently, not wanting to pry, but unable to control her curiosity. Audrey shook her head, her expression heavy with pain. "No, that's why I come to the grave later in the day. My parents always come in the morning," Laura nodded, recalling the time she had seen Audrey's parents at the cemetery. Always at that same hour, their faces etched with grief. "Why didn't you come back home?" she asked gently, her voice quivering. "It's a long story." Woman who stood before her, weighed down by a history from which she couldn't break free, whispered, "You don't have to tell me everything. But please, I beg you, turn yourself into the police and give them your testimony and evidence." In response, Audrey firmly shook her head, refusing to budge. The principal said I'd only hurt everyone. Dozens of families. Laura was shocked to hear this, and she couldn't believe that Principal Lillian Leanne Brooks had discouraged you, wondering why she had trusted Audrey. In a moment of intense vulnerability, Laura's voice broke, and she felt a surge of emotion wash over her. Audrey's words, living in the unknown and we're all already in pain. It couldn't get any worse than this. But your testimony, it could help us. Audrey looked up at Laura, searching for sincerity, and Laura nodded fervently, her heart breaking for the women's lost children. Audrey finally spoke, breaking the long silence. As Audrey gathered herself to take a deep breath and grab her phone, the weight of Laura's words began to hit her. "I think you're right. I've wrestled with this decision for a long time, but Leland always discouraged me, and I believed she had her reasons. But seeing you here now, I'll call the police," she said, her voice growing stronger as they waited for the officer to arrive. Lord Orr's mind raced with desperation as she pleaded with Audrey, asking if she knew where her daughter Rory was. Audrey's expression changed to one of. Helen and Matthew approached, scanning the area for Laura. As a result, the tension thickened. Audrey's fear intensified as she realized that another victim's family was nearby, filling her with dread. Looking between her friend and the stranger, "Who is this?" Laura took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She nodded slowly, her gaze heavy with unspoken sorrow. "What does this mean? Where is she?" Audrey froze in her tracks as she turned to face Laura, Helen, and Matthew, and beheld the faces of those she loved, Rory and Sally, who begged her to tell the truth, her tone firm yet compassionate. She had been on the bus that day, and, as she was about to respond, a distant wail of police sirens pierced the air, freezing the moment. Audrey flinched, her instincts telling her to flee. A sense of urgency washed over the scene as two police officers showed up, their presence adding to the confusion. They approached Audrey, asked for her name, and confirmed if she was the one who had called. One of the officers asked, "Audrey, are you one of the survivors of the missing children from 27 years ago?" Audrey finally spoke up, her voice shaking but resolute. Officers glanced at each other and then radioed for a system check on her name. As they waited for confirmation, they turned to the small group gathered in the cemetery. "We need everyone to come with us to the station. We can't have any disturbances here," one officer said firmly. Audrey nodded, her face pale but determined, and she followed the officers to their squad car. Laura walked behind them. As they walked to their car, Matthew and Helen were taken aback by what had happened. Laura, overcome with shock, couldn't contain her words as she told Helen and Matthew about the revelation about Audrey, the principal's knowledge of survivors, and how it all felt like a sinister puzzle with missing pieces. Matthew furrowed his brow, thinking, "This is so strange. Why would the principal keep something like that from us?" At the police station, the trio entered a tense atmosphere filled with uncertainty. Laura recognized Officer Jensen, the same officer she had attempted to contact earlier, and he quickly looked up from his paperwork and approached them. "I apologize for not being able to take your call earlier. I was occupied with an urgent case," he explained in an obviously apologetic tone. "I was overwhelmed with a sense of urgency and frustration. The situation needed to be taken seriously, officer." Audrey had confessed to being a survivor and was finally ready to talk. Her heart was racing, but she insisted that we would reopen the case if that was true. Officer Jensen responded with a focused demeanor. He motioned for Audrey to follow him into an interview room, leaving Matthew and Helen waiting anxiously in the sterile waiting area. As the door closed behind Audrey, Laura felt a rush of hope and fear. She could only. It wasn't long before Audrey was led into the interrogation room. As soon as she did, Laura, Helen, and Matthew noticed a flurry of activity around the police station. Officers' voices rose in urgency as they received orders. The air was thick with anticipation as they overheard commands being shouted. Hopefully, Audrey would find the courage to speak the truth, and the moment would finally bring answers and maybe closure to all the families affected by the tragedy. Less than an hour later, the officers returned, leading a handcuffed Principal Lillian into the police station. Principal Lillian walked with her head down, the weight of her circumstances crushing her. Hope flickered in Laura's chest as she exchanged glances with Helen and Matthew. This was it. Audrey must have shared everything she knew with the officers. Just then, the sharp sound of police sirens sliced through the air as the unit departed, and the tension in the room grew palpable. As she looked down at her slumped shoulders, she whispered something under her breath and locked eyes with Laura, Helen, and Matthew. The officers pushed her forward with unflinching authority, leading her to the booking area. Hours passed in anxious silence as Laura, Helen, and Matthew sat there, each consumed by their thoughts about what had just happened. Suddenly, they saw an officer enter the room where Audrey was being interrogated. Laura leaned in close, tried to pick up bits of the muted conversation she overheard. The officer left the room and quickly summoned Laura, Helen, and Matthew to accompany him. Their hearts were racing as they made their way into the interrogation room, where Audrey sat with a look that conveyed both relief and apprehension. The air was heavy with a sense of urgency, and the officer wasted no time in outlining the details of the case, including the confession that Principal Brooks had made during her questioning. Her voice steady but solemn, she was the one who planned the whole class trip, framed Mr. Gregory to take the blame, was under extreme pressure, couldn't pay her debts, and the loan sharks turned out to be dangerous, threatening her family. As the officer continued, Laura's breath caught in her throat. The trip was supposed to go to Big Bend Park, but it was sabotaged. It seems that Principal Brooks plotted with the kidnappers, leading to the death of the driver. The body. This may be difficult to hear, but I must tell you the truth. Mexican gangsters targeted the female students for various forms of exploitation in our initial investigation. They abducted the teacher and the children, transported them to a border area in Mexico, and then forced them into organ trafficking. Laura's heart sank as the officer hesitated, a grim expression crossing his face. His words hung heavy and suffocating in the air as he spoke about the male student from Mexico being sold overseas as child labor. Laura felt her stomach twist in knots as the horrifying reality of the situation sunk in. She glanced at Helen and Matthew, who appeared just as stunned as she was, their faces pale from processing the terrible revelations. Audrey sat in the room, her eyes cast downward, and she raised her voice to tell Laura and Helen, "I was the only one who made it out alive," whispering with a trembling voice. 12 years ago, I succeeded in escaping from the man who had bought me and subjected me to exploitation. However, I was too traumatized and psychologically broken to confront my parents. Her eyes darted to Laura and Matthew, reflecting a mixture of shame and anguish. It was at this point that I made contact with Principal Brooks, who assisted me in starting over, paid for my apartment, and covered my living expenses. However, she insisted that I not reveal the truth to anyone because she believed it would only compound the damage I had already endured. Concern for the victims' loved ones caused Laura's pulse to quicken as she absorbed Audrey's words. She struggled to understand the emotional manipulation that had kept Audrey silent for so long. With a hint of desperation in her voice, Rory asked if anyone else had survived. Audrey shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I honestly don't know about the others. We were mostly split up, but I remember Rory and Sally didn't make it. Rory died of an overdose from the drugs they gave her. Sally was. Helen and Laura both broke down in tears at those words, their grief washing over them like a tidal wave. Audrey felt a pang of guilt, her voice cracking as she whispered, "I'm so sorry. Principal Lillian was right," but Laura firmly shook her head, saying, "You did the right thing, Audrey. It was painful, but at least we have closure, and now we can start healing, thanks to the police who listened intently." "Audrey, we are reopening the case immediately. We are in the process of filing charges against Lillian Brooks. We have already contacted Mexican authorities to pursue this new evidence. We understand the tremendous trauma you have endured. We will not hold you responsible for withholding information. However, we are seriously considering bringing charges against Lillian and the other students if this new evidence proves to be accurate." The officer hesitated, his expression softening as he looked at Laura, Ellen, and Matthew. "I know this must be incredibly difficult for you to have hope rekindled after all these years." He trailed off, unable to find the right words. Laura nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "At least now we know," she whispered. "At least after all these years, we finally know what offering witness protection is." As they were getting ready to leave the station, Audrey came out of the interview room looking exhausted, with a pale and drawn face. However, there was a newfound lightness about her, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. She expressed her gratitude to Laura, her voice thick with emotion, and the police assured everyone that they would reach out to the families of the other victims as well. "Thank you for believing me and giving me the courage to come forward." Laura felt a connection to the young woman because she had survived unimaginable horrors. As Laura, Ellen, and Matthew stepped out of the police station into the fading light of day, Laura experienced a strange mixture of emotions. She was grieving for her daughter, who had died, and she felt a fresh wave of sorrow for her loss. However, she also felt a sense of peace, as if a new beginning had begun. Finally, the chapter came to a close after being left open for far too long. As she looked at Helen and Matthew, she could see the complex emotions reflected in their eyes. They had endured 27 years of uncertainty, and while the truth was painful, it was also a relief. Standing in the parking lot, they felt the weight of the day's events. Laura took a deep breath, looking up at the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. "Now," she said, her voice steady, "we honor our children's. Justice must be served, and we must assist Audrey in creating the life she was denied for so long." Upon returning home, Laura experienced a personal transformation. Her grief remained a constant companion, but she also felt a newfound sense of purpose and determination to see this through to the end. She silently vowed to keep fighting until the full truth was revealed, for the sake of Rory, Sally, all the children lost that day, and Audrey, who had survived despite all odds. Long and difficult times lay ahead as those guilty were brought to justice. However, after 27 years of searching, Laura finally felt like she was making progress toward answers, and maybe the kind of peace she had believed was forever out of reach.